I have always believed that one can measure a man's life by the objects he leaves unfinished. A crossword puzzle with one corner blank, a violin with its bow laid across the strings, sounds unspent, and once, in a quiet Oxford pub, a glass that had not been drained. It was there that this case began, though no one could have known it at the time, least of all myself. The pub in question was a modest affair near Jericho, the sort of place whose carpet smelled of stale ale and rainwater, whose lamps gave off the weary glow of men resigned to the hour. I had gone in not for company but for silence, a kind of silence that absorbs the world rather than rebuffs it. The rain had been persistent, slanting against the windows, and I was nursing a pint in the corner, the crossword folded on the table like a recalcitrant schoolboy refusing to be solved. It was then that I noticed the glass. Not mine. Not even on my table. Across the room, set against the wall, sat a half-empty tumbler of whiskey. Its owner was absent, or perhaps had melted into the crowd. Yet the glass remained an amber ghost, catching the weak light. I thought little of it at first. People abandoned drinks for 100 reasons, a sudden appointment, a quarrel, a forgotten wallet. But the barman, an older fellow with the pallor of long service, said quietly when I asked, he ordered it. Sat down, never touched it, just rose and left. That was the puzzle's first clue, though I did not know the solution. The crossword on my table stared back at me. 5 letters, an unfinished work. I scribbled opus. It fits neatly. I remember stepping out into the rain, coat collar turned up, mind half on the whiskey, half on the crossword, and half yes, 3 halves on the peculiar emptiness of the night. There are moments in Oxford when the stones themselves seem to lean inward, pressing one toward a conclusion. This was such a night. By morning, of course, a body had been found. That is the inevitable rhythm of my work. The city hums with cloisters and bicycles and bells until suddenly it stops, breath caught, a life extinguished. The man was discovered in his college rooms at St. Aldate's, an austere place with oak beams and shelves heavy with books no one had opened in 50 years. He was seated at his desk as if to read, but his head had slumped forward, resting on the paper before him. No signs of violence, no cry heard by neighbours, merely stillness, and the oddest detail on the desk, a receipt for a single glass of whiskey from the Jericho pub, time stamped precisely at the hour I had been there. It is fashionable among detectives to claim instant recognition, to insist that they knew immediately what the truth must be. I am less inclined to that sort of mythology. What I felt was not knowledge but unease. The receipt, the untouched drink, the absence of struggle, these were fragments of a riddle whose language I did not yet understand. The college porter muttered of heart trouble. The attending physician agreed it could be natural causes, but I noticed the man's hand, stiffened in death, gripping a pen that had not been used. The ink stood fresh in the nib, yet the page was blank. Who sits to write and leaves no word behind? In the dim corridor outside his rooms, I found myself listening to the hush of centuries, as if the stones themselves carried whispers. Students passed in nervous silence. A don hurried by, eyes lowered. Death in Oxford has a way of pressing the air flat like a book slammed shut too soon. I returned to the pub that afternoon. The barman remembered the dead man, said he had come in quietly, ordered whiskey, sat for a long moment staring at nothing, and then, inexplicably, left. Did he look troubled? I asked. The barman frowned, not troubled, more as if listening to something no one else could hear. And there was one more thing. When he left, he placed the glass exactly halfway along the table, not near the edge, not near his seat, as though positioning it with care. Why? That detail clung to me. I thought again of my crossword clue, an unfinished work. the whiskey, untouched, set at a precise midpoint. Was it a message? A symbol? Walking back through the drizzle, I considered the dead man's reputation. A lecturer in philosophy known for abstruse arguments about choice and consequence. Some said brilliant, others called him impenetrable, but everyone agreed he had a fondness for precision, perhaps too much. It struck me then that the untouched glass was not abandoned at all. It was my intention, a gesture left for someone, perhaps anyone, to notice. A clue, if one believed in such things. I cannot claim certainty at that moment. Only the sensation of standing on the lip of something larger. The rain soaked into my coat, the crossword grew limp in my pocket, and still I thought of that whiskey ordered, placed, untouched. Later that night, back in my flat, I poured myself a measure of the same amber drink. It sat before me, accusingly full. I stared at it as though it might yield its meaning. I thought of unfinished lives, of words unwritten, of puzzles deliberately left incomplete. And I knew, with the certainty of a man condemned to his own curiosity, that this was no ordinary death. The city slept outside, but I did not. I wrote notes, drew lines, circled words, the receipt, the pen, the position of the glass. Each detail was too deliberate, too composed. The man had left his life as carefully as one might set down a final chord in music, resonant, unresolved. When dawn came, pale and reluctant, I found myself still at the table, the whiskey untouched. My own glass, half empty now, mirrored the one in the pub. Two unfinished works, side by side across time. And so it was that the case began not with violence nor confession, but with silence, rain, and an empty glass that no one thought to drink. Rumour in Oxford does not spread like fire. It seeps like damp through the walls of a college, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere, staining the plaster and leaving no corner untouched. By the morning after the discovery at St. Aldate's, whispers had already begun to curl along the quadrangles. A man found dead, so quietly, so tidily, that it resembled less a tragedy than the cessation of some tedious recital. Students lingered at notice boards longer than usual, pretending to study rowing schedules, while their ears tilted subtly toward the gossip. I returned to the college, not out of necessity, but out of unease. Something about that silent room with its blank page gnawed at me. The porter, a tall fellow with a face permanently fixed in disappointment, met me at the gate. He asked in the half-murmur people adopt when death is near, "Do you think it was his heart then?" I said it was too early to say, though the evidence leaned toward the expected. He nodded, unconvinced. He had seen many hearts fail in his time. They did not leave their whiskey untouched. It was then that he told me of the visitor. A woman, perhaps late 30s, dark coat, gloves. She had asked for the philosopher 2 days before his death. The porter had shown her to the staircase, and she had stayed nearly an hour. When she left, she said nothing, only adjusted her gloves with unnecessary precision, as if rehearsing composure. "Did she give a name?" I asked. He shook his head, only said she was expecting. The porter's whisper clung to me as I wandered the quad. The stones were wet, reflecting a pale sun that had no warmth. I paused at the chapel door, where the wood smelled of wax and old raincoats. Inside, a boy with a surplice was arranging hymns. He whispered too, not about the death, but about the man himself, a lecturer who spoke often of freedom, yet seemed shackled to some unseen weight. They said he was often seen late at night in the library, staring not at books but out of the high windows, as though listening for something beyond the reach of human hearing. I thought again of the untouched drink, the blank page, listening, waiting, symbols of an argument left unfinished. Crossing the quad, I found one of the younger dons, a fellow in mathematics, standing under the cloisters with a cigarette that had already died between his fingers. He muttered almost to himself, "Strange, isn't it, how sudden endings always make us speak in whispers?" He did not look at me when he said it. Perhaps he had already forgotten my presence. In the college library, the silence was not respectful but conspiratorial. A librarian told me, in that same near whisper, that the dead man had ordered a particular book the week before a volume of medieval logic, long untouched. He had collected it, yes, but it had been returned, unread. The slip still bore the date, the lines increased. Why order a book and never open it? Unless the act of asking was itself the message. I jotted a note in my pocketbook. Book borrowed, not read. Whiskey ordered, not drunk. Pen filled, not used. Actions paused at the threshold of completion. What did it signify? A philosophy, perhaps, or a puzzle set for me by a mind more precise than kind. I left the library and walked into the cloister, the air damp and cold. It was there that I heard the laughter too sharp, too sudden for the hour. Two students, both red-faced, both guilty of overhearing their own words. One of them lowered his voice quickly when I passed. They say he argued with someone the night before. Voices through the stairwell, then silence. Who, though? No one seemed willing to claim it. The rumours multiplied as they always do. A debt, a scandal, a paper refused by a journal. Some said he had been seen at Magdalen Bridge only days earlier, staring into the river as if measuring its depth. I did not believe half of it, but truth often hides among lies, the way a crossword solution hides among a dozen wrong guesses. I returned once more to the porter's lodge. The man shifted uneasily on his stool, shuffling papers. I asked about the woman again. Had she left anything? A cent, a word, a card? He hesitated, then produced a folded scrap from the drawer. Found it on the floor near the stair. Could be hers. It was the corner of an old concert program, judging by the typeface. On the reverse, faint pencil marks as though someone had used it for working out a sum. The letters formed the start of a crossword grid. One word had been attempted 7 down, concealed truth. The answer, written in cramped hands, was rumours. I felt an odd tightening in the chest. Rumours indeed. Whispers like these do not spring from nowhere. Someone had set them in motion, deliberately or otherwise. The man had lived among abstractions, yet he had left behind the most human of clues, the unfinished, the unspoken, the whispered. That night, alone in my room, I opened the evening paper. The crossword stared back at me. 8 across, that which spreads without evidence. I wrote the word rumour in a hand that trembled more than I would admit. I poured myself a drink, not whiskey this time, but gin, the sharpness of it better suited to the hour. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the glass like fingers seeking entry. The city was full of whispers. I wondered which of them I ought to listen to. And so the case deepened not with a revelation, but with a murmur, faint yet persistent, like breath against stone. The dead man's silence had already begun to echo, and Oxford, in its usual manner, was only too eager to supply the words he had withheld. If rumours seep through Oxford like damp, then missing paper is the draught that follows the absence of something expected, an emptiness that chills more than the thing itself. I returned once again to the philosopher's rooms, though I knew the physician and the college authorities would prefer I let the matter fade into bureaucracy. But silence does not satisfy me, and I have never trusted a room until I have walked it alone. It was afternoon when I stepped inside, and the air still carried the faint odour of extinguished fire. Books lined the walls, their spines solemn as judges. The desk remained as it had been, save for the clearing away of the body. His pen still lay there, dried now, its tip a frozen promise. A candle had burned low, wax hardened into stalactites across the saucer. And there, beside the blank sheet that had so disturbed me, I noticed a mark in the grain of the wood, an indentation, faint yet deliberate, where another sheet had once lain and been torn away. I bent close, my breath stirring dust, and saw the torn fibres at the edge. Someone had pulled the page out swiftly but not carefully. Tiny scraps remained, like feathers of a bird plucked in haste. My eyes lingered there, longer than necessary. A page gone missing in a scholar's room is not absence, it is intention. I ran my fingers lightly across the blotting pad. The surface was smudged, yes, but under the right angle of light I thought I saw the faintest imprint of letters pressed through the missing page. My mind supplied half-words, broken stems, curves of consonants. Nothing legible, but enough to tell me that something had been written. He had begun, then chosen, or been forced to remove the record. Crossword puzzles teach one to live with fragments. A clue only makes sense once the crossing words confirm it, but until then one holds on to syllables like lifebuoys. So I thought of that blank sheet, the torn edge, the shadow of ink not quite seen. What word had begun to form? What confession had been half-written, then denied existence? The porter entered quietly as I lingered at the desk. He seemed uneasy, as though the room itself accused him of trespass. He told me he had seen another Don here, yesterday, after the discovery. The fellow in classics, a man fond of declaiming Latin to inattentive undergraduates. He had stood at the desk, staring at the blank sheet for some minutes, then walked out without a word. I asked what he thought of it. The porter said only that he looked disappointed, like a gambler seeing the wrong card fall. The page, the visitor, the whisper of disappointment. Threads began to knot, though loosely, not enough to hold. Later I made my way to the college library again. The rain had ceased, but the stones glistened as though reluctant to let go. Inside, the scent of paper pressed against me. I asked the librarian whether any manuscripts or notes had been recently checked out under the dead man's name. She frowned and admitted that a file had been logged, then returned, but when she opened the box earlier that day, a portion of the contents were missing. A single folded essay, she thought, though she had not read it. She seemed embarrassed by her own uncertainty, like a clerk caught in neglect. That word essay returned me to the desk. A page torn away, an essay vanished, a philosophy left, incomplete. What man of logic abandons his own work in fragments, unless the incompleteness itself was the message? I went out to the quad and sat beneath the cloisters. Students hurried past with their books clutched like shields. One, braver than the rest, stopped and spoke. He said the lecturer had been overheard arguing with himself in his rooms, pacing, dictating aloud, then pausing suddenly to mutter, "No, not that, never that." The boy had laughed about it at the time, but now he seemed ashamed, his eyes sliding away. He asked me if I thought it was suicide. I told him softly that I was not convinced. In the evening, I returned to my own rooms and opened the day's crossword. 10 across, something deliberately left undone. I smiled grimly as I wrote the answer, omitted. As the letters filled the grid, I thought again of the torn page. Omission is never innocent. To remove is to choose, and choice is itself an act of meaning. Perhaps the missing page would never be found, but its absence spoke louder than presence. A silence on paper, deliberate as the untouched glass of whiskey, deliberate as the book, borrowed and unread. The case was gathering into a pattern of incompletions, a philosophy of absence, if one could call it that. Yet even absence has its authors. I sat long into the night, gin untouched beside me, and listened to the city. Bells tolled faintly across the rooftops, footsteps echoed against the cobbles, and somewhere a door closed with the heaviness of finality. My notes lay before me, lines and arrows linking glass, book, page, word. Nothing solved, but something somewhere is beginning to flicker into meaning. And I knew then, with the melancholy certainty that comes before a storm, that the missing page would haunt the rest of this case like a ghost never quite acknowledged, yet never gone. The Dons of Oxford have a habit of mourning through ritual, not with tears or prayers, but with gathering wine poured into glasses, words recited that sound solemn enough to be mistaken for grief. It was 2 nights after the discovery when I found myself seated in the senior common room, a space so heavy with curtains and dust that even silence seemed upholstered. The fire spat occasionally, and the air smelled faintly of claret and polish. The occasion, if one can call it that, was informal. A handful of fellows had convened not to discuss the death directly, but to allow their voices to skirt around it. I had been invited more out of courtesy than desire. They regarded me as one might a necessary imperfection, in a room otherwise designed for comfort, too blunt a reminder that death was not an abstract. Wine was poured, and with it came verse. A fellow in English, narrow-faced, offered a reading from Hardylines about the suddenness of departure, the futility of expecting tomorrow. Another, less literate, attempted a Latin epigram, only to falter on the second line. Laughter followed, brittle and misplaced. The classics man, the one I had heard, was seen in the philosophers' rooms, smiled thinly, and corrected the meter. He had a way of speaking that seemed both indulgent and cruel, as though every word were a demonstration of his own superiority. I watched him more closely than I should have. He sipped his wine with deliberate slowness, rolling it across his tongue as though testing it for poison. When the Englishman remarked that the philosopher's death had been peaceful, almost enviable, the classicist's smile sharpened. He said softly, "Death is never enviable, only its timing may flatter." Then he looked at me, just for a moment, as though daring me to argue. I said nothing. The fire did the speaking for us, cracking like a bone splitting. My deduction came not from words, but from a gesture. When the steward replenished glasses, the classicist lifted his by the stem rather than the bowl, careful not to leave prints on the polished surface. It was the sort of gesture learned through habit, not affectation. A man who leaves no trace, a man accustomed to erasure. My mind returned to the torn page on the philosopher's desk. The conversation moved to poetry. One of the younger fellows recited a fragment of Hausmann, lines about scholars fading before their time. He faltered, embarrassed by his own earnestness. The classicist finished the stanza for him with precision, then raised his glass as if in salute to the absent man. There was no warmth in it, only accuracy, as though words were tools to be sharpened rather than lived. I asked casually whether any of them had seen our philosopher in recent days. A don in mathematics muttered that he had briefly in the quad. The man had been holding a scrap of paper, folded, perhaps a letter. He had seemed agitated, muttering lines under his breath. "What lines?" I asked. The mathematician frowned. "Not mathematics. Verse, perhaps, something with rhyme." He had been counting syllables on his fingers. Verse, then, a page torn away, a receipt for whiskey, all fragments of something performed rather than lived. When the gathering broke, I lingered in the doorway. The classicist approached me. His smile was small, cold. He remarked that philosophy was always unfinished, and perhaps the dead man had chosen to embrace that truth. He left the sentence hanging as though it were a quotation from a text only he had read. I watched him depart down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the stone, measured, dismissive. Later that night, back in my room, I opened the crossword once more. 6 down a fragment of poetry, 5 letters. The answer was verse. I filled it in slowly, considering the irony. The verse is always fragmentary, even when complete. I poured a glass of wine and let it sit. The classicist's gesture returned to me his avoidance of leaving fingerprints, his calculated way of finishing another's stanza, his smile sharp as glass. The wine before me tasted bitter. I set it aside untouched. The city outside pressed its damp breath against the window. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed, not for mourning, not for joy, merely because time insisted on being kept. I listened to the sound fade. The philosopher had died with a page missing, a glass untouched, a book unread. The classicist drank carefully, left nothing behind, and finished other men's words with too much precision. Wine and verse, 2 forms of disguise, 2 ways of appearing profound while concealing something essential. I stared at my notes until the ink blurred. Nothing solved. Yet something moved beneath the surface, faint and insistent, like a line of poetry half-remembered, waiting to be spoken. And so I left the wine untouched and allowed the verse to whisper in my mind. The case, unfinished as ever, pressed more heavily than the glass itself. The Thames at Oxford does not flow with haste. It lingers, curves, pretends to hesitate, as though reluctant to leave the city it has known for centuries. On certain mornings the water takes on the colour of lead, holding within it the reflection of towers and arches, until the wind smears them away. It was to this river that I was drawn, for someone had mentioned the philosopher had been seen here days before his death, gazing into its surface with the stillness of a man measuring more the depth. I walked there, in the thin light of late afternoon, coat collar against the chill, shoes sinking into damp ground. Bicycles lay chained by the bridge, their frames wet with drizzle. Rowers pulled across the water in silence, blades slicing rhythmically, their shouts carrying faintly. The air smelled of cold iron and wet reeds, and on the far bank, near the path where the willows lean low, stood a woman in a dark coat and gloves. She was not out of place, not conspicuous, yet something about the stillness of her figure caught me. She looked neither at the rowers nor the bridge, but into the water, as if searching for an answer written beneath its shifting skin. Her gloves were pale, not black, and she touched her fingers together slowly, a nervous rehearsal of composure. I approached without hurry. My footsteps on the wet path startled a bird, which darted up and vanished into the branches. The woman turned only when I stood beside her. Her face was fine-boned, almost severe, though softened by eyes that carried too much distance. She said quietly that the river never forgets. I asked whether she had known him. Her mouth tightened. I know him, yes. Understood him, no. Few could. There was a pause then, broken only by the water striking the banks. She told me she had once studied under him, though not formally. He had read her essays, written letters in the margins, argued about choice and consequence. He had insisted that philosophy must be lived, not merely thought, and yet he had lived like a man awaiting permission. I asked when she had last seen him. She hesitated. At the college, 2 days before his death. She had visited in the late afternoon. The porter had told me as much, but hearing it from her was different. She admitted they had argued, not about philosophy, she said, but about a paper. He wanted to publish it, and she wanted it destroyed. She believed it was dangerous, not in content, but in implication. I asked what it implied. She looked back to the river and said only that words can kill more thoroughly than weapons. Her gloved hands pressed together as though to steel them. I noticed a faint trace of ink on the edge of one glove, almost invisible against the pale fabric. Ink does not lie, I thought. A page torn, a letter unwritten, yet the ink had marked her nonetheless. I asked what had become of the paper. She said she did not know. He had refused her plea. Perhaps he burned it. Perhaps he hid it. Perhaps, she added with a voice barely audible, perhaps he died for it. The rowers passed again, oars flashing in symmetry. She watched them, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She asked whether I believed he had died naturally. I said the body had shown no struggle. She smiled faintly at that and said, absence of struggle is not absence of violence. There are other ways. Her words lingered. She adjusted her gloves, pulling at the fingers too long, a gesture the porter had described. I recognized it now not as vanity but as armor. When she left, she walked quickly, the reeds brushing against her coat. I stood there longer, letting the water speak. A torn page, a blank sheet, an unfinished glass, and now a woman with ink-stained gloves by the river. The pattern pressed closer. That evening, in my room, I turned to the crossword once more. 11 across. The one who conceals more than she reveals. 6 letters. I filled in the Sphinx. The woman had spoken, yet her silence weighed heavier than her words. I poured myself a small whiskey and stared at it. Half a glass, amber in the lamplight. I thought of him, leaving his own drink untouched. Perhaps that was the truest philosophy of all, that what is left incomplete speaks louder than what is finished. The river whispered in my memory as I set down my pen. The case was no clearer, yet it had acquired a face, a woman, gloves marked with ink, standing by the slow, dark water of Oxford, where truths dissolve like paper left too long in the current. There are few things more treacherous than an answer that arrives too quickly. A false solution is more dangerous than ignorance, for it carries the comfort of closure, and closure is what most people crave when faced with death. By the 6th day, the college authorities had chosen their conclusion. A heart stopped, a life concluded, and no further need for questions. Papers were signed, whispers discouraged, and the matter tidied away like ash swept into the grate. Yet I could not accept it. Something resisted. Perhaps it was the untouched glass in Jericho, or the torn page on the desk, or the woman by the river with ink on her gloves. Perhaps it was only my own refusal to allow puzzles to remain unsolved. But when the physician declared heart failure, I found myself almost laughing. A heart fails, yes, but only after other things have failed first. I spent that afternoon in the Bodleian, surrounded by the smell of vellum and dust, listening to my shoes echo in the endless aisles. I retrieved the philosopher's last published paper, a dry meditation on freedom and necessity. Its margins were precise, almost cold, yet one passage caught my eye. He argued that freedom was not the ability to choose, but the obligation to leave choices incomplete, to resist resolution. The words pulsed with irony. He had died leaving everything incomplete, the book unread, the whiskey untouched, the page torn. Still the college preferred its false solution. A fellow stopped me at the library door, his voice dropping to the obligatory hush. "Better not to probe," he said. The man was brilliant, but troubled. Troubled men sometimes stop of their own accord. I asked if he had evidence. He looked at me as though I had asked for proof of rain. It was easier to believe in heart failure than to accept that someone might have helped him towards silence. I walked to the chapel that evening. The choir rehearsed faintly, their voices drifting through stone like incense. A hymn of resignation, sung in young voices that had not yet learned its meaning. I sat in the back pew, alone, watching the light fade through the glass. And there, against the hymnals, I noticed a folded scrap of paper. I opened it. Half a crossword, completed in cramped script. The clue unfinished at the bottom read, "That which deceives by seeming to fit 9 letters." The answer was a written solution. I held the scrap longer than I should have. It might have been a coincidence. Students leave puzzles everywhere. Yet the handwriting resembled the philosopher's own, spidery and disciplined, a false solution, his warning, or his confession. The hymn ended. Silence pressed against me. That night I drank more than usual, whiskey this time, not gin. The glass sweated against my palm. I thought of the classicist with his spotless gestures, of the woman with her gloves, of the torn page, of the receipt. Too many details that resisted the tidy conclusion the college preferred, too many gaps that refused to close. At midnight I rose and laid out my notes across the table. Lines and arrows, fragments of verse, whispers from the porter, rumors from the students. I stared at them until my eyes blurred. Nothing formed a pattern, yet I could not escape the conviction that a pattern existed. It was as if the crossword had been constructed in another language, one I almost recognized, one whose letters shimmered just out of reach. I found myself muttering aloud, "Freedom is the refusal to conclude." He had written that, or something near it. And yet his death was already being concluded for him. Heart failure, case closed, a false solution, but one the college welcomed. Near dawn, exhausted, I filled in the last blank of the day's crossword. 7 down, something that seems right until proved wrong, 4 letters. I wrote an idea. The letters crossed neatly with others, but I felt no satisfaction. The grid was full, but the answer was false. I leaned back, the city outside pale with first light, and felt the weight of incompletion pressing harder than ever. The case was not finished, perhaps it never would be, yet I could not let it rest. False solutions are more dangerous than unsolved puzzles, because they silence the questions that might have saved us. And so I sat there with my drink half gone and the crossword filled but not solved, and told myself the only truth I knew, that the worst lies are the ones we choose to believe. Memory is rarely sharp. It bleeds, it fades, it develops cracks where certainty ought to remain. I have come to believe it resembles not ink on paper but an old photograph, sepia-toned, edges curling, its details dimming even as the feeling of the moment lingers with intolerable clarity. That evening, when the porter slipped a small envelope into my hand with the awkward air of someone breaking a minor rule, I found myself staring into just such a fragment of memory, though it was not mine. The envelope contained a single photograph, its gloss long dulled into brownish haze. It showed the philosopher, younger by at least a decade, standing on a riverbank with 2 others, a woman, her face turned slightly from the lens, and a man whose features were blurred by shadow. The philosopher looked as he never had in life to me, untroubled, almost amused. His hair was darker, his posture less guarded, his expression softer. Yet it was his hand that struck me most. It rested lightly on the woman's shoulder, a gesture of familiarity at odds with the reputation of a man so sternly private. The porter muttered that he had found it tucked between the pages of a book when clearing the room. He should have left it, perhaps, but he thought I ought to see it. I asked if he recognized the others. He shook his head, eyes lowered, as if even speculation might betray some unwritten rule of discretion. I carried the photograph to my rooms, the city's evening bells still echoing across the rooftops. I laid it on the table beneath the lamplight. Sepia renders every expression ambiguous, every glance uncertain. The blurred man could have been smiling, or frowning, or merely caught between movements. The woman's half-turned face refused to yield its truth. Only the philosopher seemed definite, and yet I had never seen him less like himself. I poured a whiskey and stared at the image. The glass remained half full on the table, ignored as the hours slid by. What was it about that hand on the woman's shoulder? Possession? Affection? Or simply the casual contact of long familiarity? A photograph does not answer. It only insists that the question must be asked. The next morning, I carried the image to the Bodleian, where the archivist owed me a favour. He frowned at the photo through his spectacles. Late 50s, early 60s, he said. The style of coat, the texture of the print, perhaps even earlier. He looked again at the riverbank in the background. Not Oxford, he declared, but somewhere narrower, quieter. Maybe Godstow, maybe Iffley. Then he shrugged and said what all archivists eventually say, photographs lie. I left unsatisfied, though not entirely empty-handed, narrower, quieter, a memory staged away from the public gaze. That afternoon I called upon the classicist. His rooms were lined with books in Greek and Latin, volumes arranged with military severity. The air smelled of tobacco, though he claimed not to smoke. I showed him the photograph. He studied it for a long while, his expression unreadable. At last he said the philosopher had once been more companionable, less obsessed with his abstractions. He said the woman was likely a former student, though he could not name her. His voice lingered oddly on the word student, neither quite respectful nor quite dismissive. I asked about the blurred figure. The classicist looked directly at me then, and his smile was deliberate. Blurred faces are often the most important, he said. He handed the photograph back as though it burned. That evening I returned again to the chapel. Its silence had become a second room to me, one where thought could echo without disturbance. I laid the photograph on the pew beside me and tried to imagine the scene as it had been. A river, laughter perhaps, a hand on a shoulder, someone holding the camera, another figure half caught. Memory preserved, yet distorted. I opened the crossword folded in my pocket. 9 across, that which fades yet leaves an impression, 8 letters. The answer was a snapshot. I wrote it down slowly, the pencil pressing hard. The word fit perfectly, but its adequacy felt cruel. The bells tolled Compline. Students drifted in for a prayer or two, their voices hushed. I remained seated alone, but for the photograph. When I finally slipped it back into my coat, I noticed the corner bore a faint crease, as though folded once and then hastily smoothed. It had not always been meant for the light. Back in my room, I placed it beneath the blotter, leaving only the blurred outline visible at the edge. It stared back at me even as I tried to ignore it. A page torn away, a drink untouched, a lecture unwritten, and now a photograph in sepia, every clue a gesture toward incompletion, every detail insisting on silence more than speech. I drank little that night. The glass remained nearly full. I sat at the desk listening to the city's midnight hush, and I thought of how photographs capture nothing but the illusion of certainty. The philosopher had once smiled, the woman had once turned away, the blurred figure had once existed, more clearly than I could ever recover. A false solution comforts a sepia photograph. Both deceive, but in different languages. And so the case deepened, not with revelation, but with another image, another silence, another fragment of a life that refused to explain itself. I slept poorly, the photograph vivid in my dreams, its figures shifting, refusing to settle. In the morning light it looked no clearer. Sepia does not fade quickly, it only insists on ambiguity. There are absences that unsettle because they are expected pages torn from a notebook, glasses left untouched, words that falter into silence. But there are other absences more cruel, those that arrive without warning, like a candle extinguished by a draught one never felt. It was late on a Thursday when I learned of the second vanishing, and with it the case shifted from a melancholy puzzle into something colder. The porter found me near the quad, his manner uneasy, his cap held low as though to shield his eyes. He said the woman, the one with the gloves, had not been seen since her riverside conversation. She had taken rooms at a modest lodging house off Walton Street, but the bed had not been slept in, the key left on the counter. No luggage, no forwarding address, no trace. She had simply folded herself out of Oxford, leaving the faint impression of presence that lingers when one steps back from a photograph. I walked to Walton Street in the evening drizzle. The lodging house smelled of paraffin and cabbage, its wallpaper peeling in damp patterns. The landlady insisted the woman had seemed calm, composed, but her voice cracked on the word composed. She remembered the gloves, such delicate gloves for a place like this. She also remembered the ink stains, faint, almost apologetic. She had meant to remark on them, but the woman had pressed the key into her hand and departed without farewell. The room itself was bare. A narrow bed, a chipped jug of water, a single window facing the grey wall of another house. Yet on the sill I found a scrap of paper folded small, almost hidden, by the curtain. A line of verse, copied in cramped hand. The river takes what it is given and does not return. Nothing more. No name, no date. Only that line. I slipped it into my notebook. I thought then of the photograph, the blurred figure, the philosopher's hand on the woman's shoulder. I thought of the ink on her gloves, the way she had touched her fingers together at the riverbank as though stifling tremors. And now she had vanished, as neatly as if she had stepped into the water herself. The college, when I returned, was quick to discourage speculation. She was no one of consequence, a visitor, perhaps embarrassed by scandal, best not to pursue. Their eagerness to silence unsettled me more than the vanishing itself. Silence was becoming their chosen solution to every disruption. A deathly silence, a torn page of silence, a disappearance of silence. But silence is not absence of truth. It is only its postponement. That night I walked again to the philosopher's rooms. They were locked, but the porter let me in with reluctance. The air was stale now, the books standing like mute sentinels. I sat at the desk where he had slumped, staring at the blotter. In the lamplight, faint impressions showed where a page had been torn. I rubbed gently with a soft pencil, a trick learned in younger days. Lines emerged, not words, but the faint outline of a grid. A crossword? It was incomplete, of course. Only 2 words are visible. One river, the other vanished. I leaned back and let the pencil fall. He had left his philosophy in the language of puzzles, and she too had spoken in verse of rivers and disappearance. Did they conspire in symbols, or had she inherited his obsession with incompletion? Sleep did not come. I poured whiskey and let it stand untouched, the amber deepening as the hours stretched. Near dawn I opened the crossword in the newspaper. 13 down that which disappears without trace, 7 letters. I wrote vanish, my hand unsteady. The clue and its answer sat there with the stillness of inevitability. Later that morning I walked again by the Thames. The water carried branches, wrappers, fragments of light. I watched it for a long while. It would have been too easy for her to slip beneath its surface and let the current carry her away. But the river, unlike Oxford, does not keep secrets. It always returns what it cannot hold. Yet no body had been found, no luggage traced, only a key left behind and a line of verse folded on a sill. The city moved around me unconcerned. Students hurried to lectures, bells called the faithful, bicycles rattled past puddles, and still I felt the ache of absence pressing harder than presence. One disappearance might be explained, Two spoke of patterns, a page gone, a woman gone, both tied to a man whose death had already been too carefully concluded. That evening I returned to my notes. I drew a line from the philosopher's receipt to the torn page, from the sepia photograph to the woman at the river, from the folded verse to the crossword imprints. All the arrows circled one word, vanish. And yet the word solved nothing. It was a false solution again, a neat answer that concealed more than it revealed. I stared at the half-full glass on my desk. The philosopher had left his whiskey untouched. She had left her key untouched. Both gestures of refusal, both vanishing acts. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether the truest clue in all this was not in what had been done, but in what had been deliberately left undone. The bells struck midnight. I turned the photograph over, face down, as though it might silence the blurred figure who seemed to watch me. But silence is not a memory. It only sharpens its outline. And so another absence entered the case, not with explanation, but with a key laid quietly on a counter and a line of verse folded. Against a window, a second vanishing, as incomplete and as deliberate as the first. It is remarkable how often the smallest of errors are syllables slurred. A vowel mistake becomes the fissure through which a case opens. We place too much trust in our hearing, as though the ear were not as treacherous as the eye. That evening, long after the second vanishing, I sat alone in my room with the window ajar, listening to the rain strumming the stone below. My notes lay spread before me in their untidy constellation. And it was then rereading a line from the porter's account that I realized something had been misheard. He had told me that the woman, on leaving the philosopher's rooms, had said she was expecting. But as I let the words whisper themselves again in my head, I found they carried another possibility. Perhaps she had said inspected. 2 syllables, blurred by accent or fatigue, easily mistaken. Expected, inspected. The difference between an invitation and an intrusion. I rose restless and paced the narrow confines of the room. If she had been expecting, she would have been a guest. If inspected, then she had come to challenge, to search, perhaps even to threaten. The nuance altered everything, like a crossword clue whose surface meaning diverts you from its true intention. The crossword of the day confirmed the thought. 8 across word, distorted, alters meaning entirely. 10 letters. I filled in mishearing and smiled bleakly at the coincidence. Or was it a coincidence? By then I no longer trusted the city not to conspire against me. The following afternoon I returned to the porter, whose face by now carried the weariness of too many questions. I asked him to recall again the exact sound of the woman's words. He frowned, muttering that memory distorts, but he admitted that she might indeed have said inspected. He had been distracted at the time by the rattle of a bicycle at the gate, and he could not be certain. His uncertainty pressed on me heavier than any certainty could have. I walked from the lodge to the library, the stones wet underfoot, the sky low with mist. Students hurried past in muted pairs, their voices muffled by scarves. Inside, the scent of old paper hung thick as incense. I asked the librarian whether anyone had been inspecting manuscripts that week. She frowned, consulted her ledger, and pointed to an entry. A female hand, anonymous, had requested access to a restricted folio of the philosopher's unpublished lectures. The date matched her visit. There it was, then, not expected but inspecting. She had come not as a guest but as an examiner, a reader of something hidden. I turned the brittle folio pages with care. Most of the text was impenetrable arguments about the ethics of silence, the necessity of omission. But in the margin of one page, a note in his spidery hand caught me. Words misheard are words misunderstood, and from misunderstanding, ruin. I sat there a long while, listening to the tick of the reading room clock, the shuffle of papers around me. The philosopher had written it years before, perhaps, yet it echoed the present with unsettling clarity. That evening, I encountered the classicist in the cloister. His smile was as polished as ever, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fatigue. He asked whether I had reached my conclusion. I told him I mistrusted conclusions. He laughed quietly and said philosophy, too, mistrusted them. Then he added, almost idly, that one should never believe the first version of what is heard. Students repeat rumors, porters repeat mutterings, and the truth drowns beneath mishearing. He said it with the air of a man quoting someone else, though he gave no source. I walked away unsettled. His words aligned too neatly with the note I had just read. Was it coincidence, or was he quoting the philosopher directly from a lecture no one had seen? And if so, how had he known? That night, alone again, I stared at the sepia photograph. The blurred man, the turned-away woman, the philosopher with his hand on her shoulder. Perhaps the blur itself was a mishearing in visual form, the image misread by the camera, the truth drowned in shadow, expected, inspected, smiling, frowning, touch affectionate or coercive. We mishear with our eyes as well as our ears. I poured myself half a glass of wine. The rain had stopped, leaving the night sharp and cold. I let the glass rest untouched while I wrote the word, inspected in my notes, circling it, underlining it. A single word, perhaps spoken differently, perhaps remembered differently, but heavy with consequence. The crossword remained on the table. 4 down. That which leads astray by sound alone, 9 letters. The answer, of course, was mishearing. I had written it once already. I wrote it again, darker this time, as though the repetition might bind it more securely. But the truth, if it was true, offered no closure. The woman was still gone. The philosopher was still dead. And the city remained shrouded in its silences, its corridors echoing with rain. I sat back, listening to the empty hush, and told myself what I already knew. A misheard word can alter the course of everything. A promise mistaken for a threat, an invitation mistaken for an inspection. And somewhere, between syllables blurred and remembered badly, Oxford was keeping its secrets. By the 10th day, the case had become less an investigation than an accumulation of silences. A death, a disappearance, a torn page, a photograph in sepia fragments scattered across Oxford like rainwater darkening the stone. And yet there was always something left unspoken, withheld, erased. That evening, when the librarian summoned me with the hesitant urgency of someone fearing she had overstepped, I felt at once the familiar ache of anticipation. She had uncovered something in the philosopher's books, something she was unsure whether to reveal. I met her in the upper reading room, where dusk fell faster than anywhere else in the city. The windows were high, the air faintly scented with leather and dust. She had set aside a single volume, its spine cracked, its title faint. A collected Aristotle, the edition scholars touch as though it were scripture. She opened it with care, revealing not words, but a faint scratching in the margin of the final page. It was not ink, but graphite, the marks shallow, tentative. An inscription more hidden than written. I bent close under the lamp. At first I saw only faint lines, indistinct, but as the light struck differently, the letters surfaced, omnia desunt, all things are missing. I let the phrase repeat itself in my head, all things are missing. A confession, a philosophy, a warning? The librarian watched me with uncertain eyes. she said she had noticed it only by accident when dusting. She seemed almost regretful, as though by pointing it out she had disturbed a ghost that preferred its hiding place. I copied the words into my notebook, careful to preserve the shape of each letter. Omnia desert. My pencil shook slightly as though the phrase had passed through me rather than been recorded by me. When I left the library, dusk had thickened into rain. The quad glistened with the light of lanterns, footsteps echoed under arches, and I thought again of the philosopher's unfinished life. An untouched glass, a torn page, an unread book, and now a hidden inscription declaring absence as its final truth. Later that evening, I called on the classicist. His rooms were warmer than the library, though colder in spirit. He poured wine, which I refused. I asked about the phrase. He nodded almost immediately. Omnia desert, he said, is a corruption of an older maxim. Not all things are missing, but all things desired are missing. He smiled thinly, as though the correction amused him. Then he asked whether the philosopher had left it in his own hand. I told him I believed so. He said nothing more, only sipped his wine, careful again to avoid leaving marks. It was not the correction that troubled me, but the ease with which he supplied it, as though he had been waiting for the question. Back in my room, I turned to the crossword, 12 across. What remains when nothing remains? 5 letters. The answer, I thought, was void. I filled it in, though the letters looked stark, more final than the rest of the grid. I stared at the word until the page blurred. The inscription would not leave me. Omnia desert. Why write it in pencil, hidden at the margin of a book? Why not on a blank page or in a letter? Unless the point was concealment itself, unless it was intended to be discovered only by accident, as indeed it had been. Perhaps the philosopher had wanted to leave absence as his last legacy, absence carefully disguised as presence. I poured a whiskey and set it beside me, untouched. My notes sprawled across the table. I traced the lines between each absence. The missing page, the unread book, the vanished woman, the blurred photograph. Now the hidden inscription joined them, another silence dressed as a clue. But a thought began to stir, faint as dust motes in the lamplight. Omnia desert. All things are missing. Unless, I wondered, the phrase itself was incomplete, as everything else had been. Perhaps the missing thing was the final word. Omnia desert except one. But which? I pressed the pencil harder into the notebook, sketching letters that refused to finish themselves. The city outside was quiet, rain easing into mist. From somewhere distant came the toll of a bell, flat, resigned. It was near midnight when I placed the photograph beside the inscription, the philosopher's hand on the woman's shoulder, his hidden note declaring all things missing. Was she the missing element, or was it the blurred figure in the background, half erased, the human equivalent of a misheard word? The whiskey had grown flat in the glass. I lifted it, but did not drink. The case resisted conclusion, as though the philosopher's philosophy had infected it. Omnia desert. All things are missing, including, I thought bitterly, the truth. And yet the phrase was not silence. It was a presence disguised as absence, a message buried in a book, hidden in the margin, waiting for the wrong or the right eyes. He had not left anything. He had left this. I closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the dark, listening to the rain resume its slow tapping against the window. The inscription whispered in my head with the persistence of unfinished verse. Omnia desert. All things are missing, but not yet forgotten. Oxford has a way of turning endings into ceremonies. The corridors soften their echoes, the bells take on a slower weight, and even whispers seem rehearsed. By the 11th day, I had grown accustomed to absence, as the case's only refrain: absent pages, absent glasses, absent women, and yet the classicist, that precise and careful man, chose that day to speak more than he had before. His words, though measured, carried the density of something left too long unsaid. He asked me to meet him in his room at twilight. The air was damp, the quadrangle filled with mist that clung like another set of robes to each fellow who hurried past. His staircase was dim, the stone worn into grooves by centuries of shoes, the smell of wax polish heavy. I found him seated near the fire, a book in his lap, untouched wine at his side. He gestured to me to sit, his smile the same thin curve it had always been, but his eyes more restless. He began without preamble, his voice low. The philosopher had believed in omission. That much was clear. He had lectured, written, lived as though the truest truths were the ones left incomplete. But what none of us grasped, the classicist said, was how far he had carried that principle. He had omitted not only from his philosophy but from his life letters half-written, lectures never delivered, even friendship sustained more in absence than in presence. He had believed that to withhold was a form of purity. The classicist poured wine then, though he still did not drink. His hand lingered at the stem, fingers resting with deliberate care. He looked at me as if weighing whether I might complete his thought. I remained silent. He went on. The inscription in Aristotle, the torn page, the unfinished drink were not accidents. They were the man's legacy, to leave gaps for others to fill or fail to fill. But then his voice shifted, almost faltered. And yet there are omissions that wound more than they preserve. The woman. She had not forgiven him for what he chose to leave unsaid. She had demanded a word, a conclusion, and he withheld it, not only in philosophy, but in affection. She wanted certainty, and he gave her silence. His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time I thought I saw something human beneath the polished cruelty. The fire hissed. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass. He set his wine aside, untouched. He said he had argued with the philosopher the night before his death. Argued fiercely. He had begged him to speak plainly, to abandon omission for once, to tell her the words she sought. But the philosopher had smiled, shrugged, and muttered, omnia desunt. All things are missing. The classicist's smile returned, brittle as glass. I told him that phrase was a corruption, that he himself had said as much. He nodded. Exactly. He had said so to the philosopher as well, and the philosopher laughed. His last words to me were that correction changes nothing. All things are missing. We sat in silence for a long while. His gaze was fixed not on me but on the fire, as though the flames contained the argument replaying itself. His words had been confession, and yet not. They gave no conclusion, no solution, only another absence. I left him then, the corridor stretching long and cold, the floorboards creaking under my tread. The chapel bell tolled faintly, the sound half swallowed by fog. I carried with me not revelation, but the echo of words that meant less, the more they were repeated. All things are missing. Back in my room, I opened the crossword. 15 down, what remains when language fails? 4 letters. I wrote void. The letters crossed neatly, but the words stared back with merciless simplicity. I thought of the philosopher's final hourglass, ordered but not drunk, pen filled but not used, page begun but torn away. A philosophy of absence enacted to the last breath. And now the classicist's last words about him, an echo of the same emptiness. I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the liquid shiver in the lamplight. I did not drink. The case had not delivered truth, only fragments, omissions, and now the echo of a phrase. The Don's last words were not revelation, but another silence disguised as speech. The city outside was hushed, mist dissolving into rain. I sat there listening, the inscription whispering still in my head, Omnia desunt. All things are missing, and I wondered whether the truest clue of all was that nothing had ever been meant to be solved, only left incomplete like the crossword grids that fill themselves yet never satisfy. There are nights when Oxford seems to fold in on itself, as though the spires and cloisters were drawing closer, attempting to keep whatever secrets they hold from escaping. On such nights, the streets are too quiet, the lamps too dim, and the sound of one's own footsteps carries like a confession. It was on such a night that the case reached its conclusion, or its lack of one, and I found myself, as too often before, alone. I had returned from the classicist's rooms with the words still echoing in my head. Omnia desunt. All things are missing. Words that were meant as philosophy, perhaps, but lingered as accusation. They followed me through the mist-dampened streets, over the cobbles slick with rain, beneath the silent windows of colleges where candles had long since guttered. By the time I reached my own rooms, I knew I would sleep little. I lit the lamp and set my notes before me. The table had become a map of incompletions, a receipt for whiskey never drunk, a torn scrap of crossword, a photograph blurred into ambiguity, a line of verse folded on a sill, an inscription hidden in the margin of Aristotle. Each fragment told less than it concealed. I traced the lines between them with my finger, but the pattern refused to form. The man had left me an inheritance. I poured whiskey, though even the act felt redundant. The glass sat before me, accusing in its fullness, mirroring the philosopher's own gesture in Jericho. It was almost dawn, and I had become a parody of the man I sought to understand. His omissions had infected me. I, too, left the glass untouched, the page half-filled, the questions unspoken, but something in me resisted surrender. I turned to the crossword, the one I had begun earlier, its grid weighted, patient, offering the illusion of order. 13 across, a thing left incomplete, 7 letters. The answer was fragment. I wrote it slowly, pressing the pencil into the paper until the graphite threatened to tear through. Fragment. That was what remained of him, of her, of all of it. I thought again of the woman by the river. Her pale gloves, her ink stains, her refusal to answer plainly. She had vanished, and no trace had surfaced. Was she swallowed by the water, or had she chosen another kind of disappearance, one less visible, but no less absolute? I had no proof either way. Perhaps that was the point, absence as conclusion. The classicist's voice returned then, that brittle smile carried in tone. Omission is a form of purity. He had believed it, and so I realized, with something close to despair, had the philosopher, and perhaps the woman too. Each of them had withheld something, a word, a gesture, a presence, until silence itself became the only truth left standing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling where the lamplight cast shadows into corners. I asked myself whether I had solved anything. The city outside was unchanged. Bicycles leaned against gates, rain traced the same paths down the same windows, bells tolled the same indifferent hours. The philosopher was still dead. The woman was still missing. The inscription still whispered its bleak promise. Omnia desunt. I looked down at the crossword once more. One clue remained blank. 9 down, that which endures when all else is gone, 4 letters. I hesitated, then wrote a word, and immediately I wondered if it was wrong. Perhaps the answer was void. Perhaps both were true. The crossword, like the case, offered more than one solution, each unsatisfactory, each incomplete. The whiskey remained half full on the desk. I raised it at last, tasted its sharpness, and set it down unfinished. Even in this, I had become his echo, a man who left everything incomplete. The dawn began to press against the window, pale and reluctant. The lamplight dimmed in comparison, and the room took on that curious hush that belongs only to mornings in Oxford. I gathered my notes, slid the photograph beneath the blotter, and closed the book on the inscription. Nothing had been solved, not in any way that mattered. And yet I knew I would carry the fragments with me, as one carries a melody half-remembered, or the ache of a word misheard long ago. Oxford would go on. Students would fill the quads, dons would argue in rooms that smelled of dust and wine, and the river would keep flowing, taking what it was given, returning little. And I, left with absence, would move through its streets carrying silence like an old companion. The bells struck 7. I finished the crossword, though I did not believe in its answers. I finished my notes, though I knew they explained nothing. And I sat there, as I had begun, with a glass half empty, and the sense of incompletion pressing closer than any truth. That was how the case ended, not with revelation, nor with justice, but with the steady insistence of silence. Omnia descent. All things are missing, and so, once again, was I.